Hello and welcome to another spoiler episode of Umineko as we finally get to episode 5 and the answer arcs. Now this video is going to contain spoilers for the entirety of the game, and even if you feel like you think you know the rest of the game, there's a lot of stuff coming. So don't watch this unless you know how it all ends, everything that's coming. This video will be covering episode 5, parts 1 through 4 of my Let's Play, because as we go further and further, there is less to say in the spoiler videos as such, because I have preemptively talked a lot about stuff. We begin as Battler tries in vain to both understand Beatrice and attempt to elicit some sort of reaction out of her. And it feels quite... And this very much mirrors kind of my feelings in this moment, literally opening first with various scenes of Beatrice from the question arcs being her most Beatrice-y self. I remember at the time being disappointed that the cackling witch character was being backgrounded as we saw other sides of Beatrice more. Not to say that I did not enjoy the further characterization of Beatrice and exploration of her character, but I did really like the parts where they were just battling over silly logic puzzles, and probably would have read tons of that stuff, but in actuality you get so little that by the time you get to here, which is not the end of that stuff, but is a sea change for a lot of this stuff, it really does feel like a, no, come back, hang on. And in a very similar vein, I had not really cracked the character of Beatrice. I truly did not understand Beatrice until it's fully revealed in episode 7. So I just was in some ways in a similar spot, although my first time reading through, I didn't spend a lot of time pausing to speculate that deeply about trying to parse out this stuff on a further level. I was mostly just continuing on and thinking about it as I read. But I think this sets up an interesting thing, and especially because of how episode 5 is written and who it's written by, the Game Master is no longer Beatrice, it is someone else using Beatrice's game board. That'll introduce some complications. There's one for part 4, so I don't think I'll get to it in this video in this particular video, but it confuses things in some ways, and again, in many ways, feels like fanfic written by someone who does not understand the central premise of the original story. It feels like a co-opting of the story to, in some ways, ostensibly do your own take on it, but in other ways to undermine and degrade the story as if you are doing a better job of it. For instance, the fact that after only one twilight, Erika is immediately declaring her success is very presumptuous. It's extremely the energy of anybody who's ever watched the story and been like, well, it's obvious who did it. I would have known. If I was there, I would have solved this in Act 1. And it's like, well, yeah, and if you did, the story would be so boring. Or you could do a fun story, I guess, where that's kind of the joke. But generally speaking, it feels like a disingenuous way to engage with the text, especially because that means you don't get the full story. You just cut off the story because you solved it too quick. It's never as satisfying as actually having the complete arc. But as we get more Erika, we will have many more chances to talk about the deeply unsatisfying way of engaging with things that she has. I love her character though. We'll get there. They call it out pretty directly with a conversation between Byrne and Lambda Delta, where Byrne says, This technically is a world Beato created. You aren't going to ruin the atmosphere of the story, are you? To which Lambda Delta replies, "Don't worry about that. I'm really good at reading between the lines for that sort of stuff. I made sure to use a Beato-ish atmosphere to make a tale that's even more interesting." So again, yeah, I can do what she did, and I can do a better job, honestly. Then we get into some backstory stuff for this episode as we backfill some more about Natsuhi and Krauss. I love this. Again, I love Natsuhi. She's a great character. She's a poor woman. She sucks in some ways. I do have sympathy for her, especially for being saddled with an awful husband that she unfortunately does love and support. One of my favourite lines in this section that is deeply revealing is when Krauss reveals how he has been behind Natsuhi's back, doing things with with Kinzo's money as collateral. He says, "There is such a thing as a man's honour. I couldn't refuse." And the narration says, "Krauss claimed to hold honour as a virtue. However, Natsuhi knew that he most often used this as an excuse for when he reluctantly went along with some deal that he just couldn't refuse." Brief note that I think this is a funny connection to the previous section where Battler didn't understand the idea that the game was being played without love, but when told that it was being played dishonorably, he was like, "That makes sense to me." And I don't think you're meant to draw too much of a parallel between these two things, but it is funny that again, honor is being used to label some intangible concept that maybe is not terribly meaningful, but still matters emotionally to people in a context. This whole dynamic between Krauss and Natsuhi, all of the backstory happening in here, one of the things I like a lot is the ambiguity of the emotions and motivations behind everything going on here. You could read this same section and come away with either the idea that Natsuhi is a unfortunate woman who has been pushed into a bad situation, stuck with a guy who sucks, doing her best to try and make the situation work, and not being given a lot to deal with. On the other hand, you could take from this situation that Natsuhi has a husband she loves. Despite his flaws and despite his recurring failures, she loves and supports him, and she will literally fake someone's non-death for 2 years for the sake of her husband. She does a hell of a lot, even as he is unwilling to engage with her in ways that he probably should. For instance, hiding things from her. And again, with his actions, you can both read this as a chauvinistic, sexist notion of him being the breadwinner, the one in charge, who's trying to hide his failures and trying to just be the domineering man that he sees in his father. Or you could take his actions and look at them and go, oh, he knows how much of a fuck up he is. He knows how much burden he puts on Natsuhi. He knows she's in a shitty arranged marriage that she didn't technically actually want to do. And he, in a very misguided sense, is trying to give her a life that he thinks she wants. As with previous situations, there is not a singular truth in one of these two things. Krauss simultaneously is probably trying to protect his ego by not getting yelled at by Natsuhi when he admits to making stupid mistakes. At the same time, he probably knows how much of a burden he puts on her, and he can't run the household. He can't help her and support her in the things she does. Scare quotes around can't, because again, the sexist structure of society dictates that that's the case, but in reality he could simply help. But if you were to assume that his belief is correct and not something he only believes for his own benefit, the best he can do, as far as he thinks, is to shield her from things and to try and take that burden on himself. And I probably said this in a previous video, but I do like about Krauss and Natsuhi the tragedy of the fact that they don't understand each other. They love each other, but don't give each other the things that they actually want, instead giving each other the things that they think the other wants or needs. In theory, Krauss would love his wife to stay in her lane and just be a doting wife who maintains the household and never has to worry about anything else and does not have, for instance, her recurring headaches. While in theory, Natsuhi would love to be involved with running the household. She would love to have the honor of being delegated to. She would be less stressed by being involved. And I truly believe that it is not ill-intentioned that they cannot meet on this, and it is more an issue of their perspectives and their assumptions about the situation that mean that they never quite align on these things. And when they clash, they argue because they're both very deeply worried about the family unit and each other and the situation and trying to fix things. And it means that they don't come to a more beneficial mutual understanding of the situation to actually go, okay, can you please just tell me when you're making weird shady deals, because I can tell you it's a bad idea and then we'll stop. The story of Krauss trying to give her the nut delicacy later, that's not a euphemism, feels emblematic of this in that he's not able to communicate to her what he is trying to give her. He is just trying to brashly come off as the worldly, traveled man, insisting that she do this thing because it's cultural. Meanwhile, she's like, I don't want to, that sounds gross. I need to seem like a dignified new wife. I can't do this. And he never straight up says, this is a custom to do with couples. I kind of want to do it because it would feel romantic. If you just went along with it, it would be a lot easier and I wouldn't have to be embarrassing and say this out loud. And she realizes, and she does realize it after the fact because somebody else technically accidentally intervenes and reveals the gesture to her. And I think I get the impression of this being quite an early formative moment of her understanding, like, oh, he's trying to be nice. He doesn't have to be. He could just be a real shitty husband if he wanted. But he genuinely is trying to give me something here. And as much as he is unable to communicate his emotions in any way, both here and later, this, at least in and of itself, gives her some reassurance that he is not just saddled with a woman who is going to look after his house for him. Much like Anji's hair clips for Battler, it is a singular moment in time that crystallizes a feeling that she returns to, because she tells this story to Beatrice many years later. It is clearly something that made an impact and that she holds on to as her magical proof of something that is intangible and not easy to refer back to. One thing that I do find fun about the whole setup of revealing the magic that is used to resurrect Kinzo is that it's very clearly a clue to understanding the nature of Beatrice and Beatrice's game as a whole, and at the same time it almost feels like a demonstration to Beatrice of how she could enact her game. It's kind of pulling double duty as both a test run of some ideas that could be used in a future family conference, while also serving as a hint to understanding the family conferences that we have seen so far. That said, obviously, Canon and Shannon were already performing a different version of this, so it's not completely out of left field for them, regardless, but it feels extra fun that the idea of masking a death, making someone alive, and the trickery and theater around it is a lot of how the actual murder games go. The scene between Natsuhi and Beatrice is quite sweet. One specific character note I like in particular is the ways in which it gestures at Natsuhi being quite naive. There's a lot of cases where Natsuhi is presented as if she's a little bit foolish, not very worldly or experienced in things, and perhaps a little slow on the uptake of things as a result. But I think, yet again, in terms of seeing another perspective on these scenes, there's a way in which Natsuhi is also just quite charitable in her reads of things and situations. She idolizes Kinzo partly because it is expected of her as a person being adopted into the family, and partly because she is willing to praise his positive sides and dismiss the negative ones, in fact outright deny the possibility of any negative sides. In a similar way, there's a brief gesture towards her upbringing where Beatrice refers to it as like, oh, it seems like it must have been very rigid. Natsuhi says, it was strict, but they gave me a wonderful upbringing. It would be rude to my father and mother to call that rigid. Which Beatrice says sounds like she's just dancing around calling it very rigid. And to me, this kind of indicates the ways in which Natsuhi gives charitable reads to things, is very polite, and is willing to take a positive perspective on what sounds like a pretty awful home life she had. You have to imagine, if she's happy to be adopted into the Ashuramiya family, her original family must not have been very good. I kind of assume it's somewhat comparable to the Sumaderas, and maybe not quite as cutthroat and abusive, but maybe it was. I don't think, at least in terms of the game itself, we get too much more on that, but as this episode goes on, we'll obviously get little hints like this now and then. And just as a slight offshoot of that, it is fun in the scenes where Natsuhi is imagining Beatrice or Kinzo, how she offloads the more critical and snippy kind of comments onto them. This scene, she is projecting a Beatrice who says, yeah, sounds like your home life was pretty rigid. She herself says, oh no, that would be rude. Then Beatrice, who is a mouthpiece for Natsuhi in this scene, can still say, yeah, sounds like it sucked. Likewise, Kinzo can be very brash, and he can say whatever he wants, to be honest, including criticizing Krauss in a way that Natsuhi herself cannot as his devoted wife. Which is not that dissimilar to Beatrice as a personality being afforded specific opportunities that, for instance, Canon and Shannon do not as personalities. I enjoyed the section where we get all of the different Ashuramiya siblings in their preamble to realizing what Krauss and Natsuhi are up to and forming their counter plan. But one thing I particularly enjoy about this sequence is how we get two other married couples and their dynamics, where Eva and Hideyoshi, as we've seen in previous cases, they're genuinely quite in love, and they have a pretty good partnership, even if Eva is maybe a little bit quick to anger, a little bit hot-tempered, perhaps. Particularly enjoy the cute detail of Eva going, yes, Hideyoshi, I know you love to talk about generals and history and stuff because you're one of those nerds and you're named after one of them, but could you explain to me what we're doing? And by contrast, the absolute train wreck of a partnership that is Rudolph and Kyrie, where Kyrie says to her husband, I'm not a fan of trust. I think it's very easy to break. In a way that feels like an extremely not that veiled threat. And he certainly takes it as such. We never get to go very deep on those two, but I truly love how much Krauss has the appearance of a, manly man and is the biggest coward of the bunch. Arguably more of a coward than Goda, at least by the scale of his actions. Goda certainly never swapped 2 children to try and get out of a relationship with a woman he was afraid of, and then ended up in a relationship with that woman anyway. In the next section, there's a line that really stood out to me because I was immensely skeptical, that the narration says, "Normally, Battler possessed the good sense you'd expect of an 18-year-old man. However, it seemed that this reunion had brought him back to the mental age he'd been 6 years ago." First of all, I don't expect that much good sense from an 18-year-old man, to be honest. Second of all, Battler? Really? And I don't know if you're meant to really question this line quite so much, but yet again it does feel like a weird narratorial voice that this episode has as a whole. This is obviously an episode written by a new person, but in particular it feels like it leans more into the beliefs of adults and how the adult world works in some strange ways. Some of this I am predicting we will get to, but I have memories of this episode overall coming down hard on Natsuhi as being delusional more than understanding her situation, and in some ways that feels like that is contrasted against, well, adults need to do difficult things. The scene where Rosa agrees to meet her siblings, then realizes that that plan clashes with her intention to bring Maria to Delsnyland. That feels like it's sympathetic to Rosa in a way that is not entirely justified because of how, yes, you can have sympathy for Rosa even as an abusive mother, but it almost is setting up a situation of being fully on her side and barely acknowledging Maria's understanding of the situation, or more importantly, her lack of understanding of the situation. And I guess part of why I have this read of this early section is because I know what Furudo Erika is going to be. She is going to be a character very much believing in the concrete, objective reality of the world, how it is correct, solvable, and is quite simple and straightforward, and how people just need to acknowledge and accept it, and not make silly, foolish challenges to do with magic, or perspectives, or ambiguity, or personal feelings. So regardless of whether this line is meant to spawn any of those thoughts, it is an overall vibe I have about how the narration is working in these sections. That again feels related to the ways in which Natsuhi gets unfairly maligned by the moment of her being cut with the red truth and it being forced into the narrative that she is sitting by herself merely imagining a Beatrice. And I think this notion of Natsuhi being deluded and divorced from reality is only furthered by the ways in which Runaway and Gop and Virgilia all get brought in, where it feels like they are being brought in to further undermine Natsuhi's point of view and further set her up as a clear and, frankly, as far as Erika will tell it, incompetent murderer. It is also funny how straight up Runaway's like, think of me as perhaps some sort of magical Genji. This being one of the sections where they're really leaning on those hints in case you missed the parallel between those two before. Now, we get to a particularly curious moment in this episode where we get an extremely definitive count of people on the island, where in the red truth it is declared that Erika's presence increases the number of people on the island by exactly 1, and then we get a quick turn around the room as everybody is in the same room, and we cycle through all of the people, including both Shannon and Cannon. Now, this is a real signal for how this episode's going to get weird, and not just because Erika has literally washed up on the beach. But I don't fully know what implications this has. My read at the moment is that this is almost a way in which the author of this episode does not actually understand the game board, and not simply in the ways I was saying before of doesn't emotionally understand it, but literally does not know the actual central riddle of the game board. One thing that's notable is that the red truth does not refer to a number of people in this moment. In fact, the red truth only increments the number of people by 1, and then we get narration, which is also to be believed, but the narration simply lists everybody and says all of the people on the island are here. Notably, because of wordings, furniture is not strictly counted as individual people. That is basically how the counts of people can still include both Shannon and Canon for people who consider them people, even if the number of human bodies does not exceed. Does that end up being 15 total? Or 16? I forget how that shakes out eventually. But it is curious to me as how this establishes a technically invalid fact. The narration, generally speaking, is not as ironclad as the red truth and not as rigid as the red truth, but this is the first time in front of the ostensible detective both Shannon and Canon have appeared in the same scene, which would be taken as being deeply misleading and wrong, or a lie, or invalid. And so I'm going to have to pull on this thread and see how it goes to see, do they end up having 2 separate dead bodies? Is there a further delineation of this? I don't remember how the episode entirely wraps. Is it possible that it even wraps as claiming this game is invalid, or that there is perhaps a logic error at the center of this game? I don't have the answers yet. This is something we'll have to keep an eye on as it develops. That is going to do it for our first spoiler video of episode 5. I look forward to having a lot more Erika stuff to talk about, as well as Delanor, who is honestly one of my favourite characters. I will love voicing her, and her weird quirk of speech. Thank you all for watching, and it is good to be back to doing the spoiler sections of these. I will probably not be doing quite as many, but maybe the mystery sections of these will get a little bit more complex and require a little bit more on the back end as we get to the Twilights in the future videos. But that's all for now. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.